At Singapore's Changi Airport, 440 passengers and 29 staff members boarded a Qantas Airways Airbus A380 early on November 4, 2010. The aircraft was making a 2-hour stopover in Singapore to refuel after taking off from London. Sydney, Australia, was the ultimate destination. The Airbus airliner and its approximately 500 passengers would hardly make it beyond Singapore on this day, even though the trip to Sydney was scheduled to take around 7.5 hours. This flight was being conducted on an airplane that was just 2 years old. Actually, it was the first of 6 A380s that Qantas would receive. The biggest passenger airplane ever constructed is the A380. With a high degree of redundancy in its onboard equipment, it was the most technologically sophisticated aircraft in the sky at the time. Thousands of sensors located throughout the aircraft were linked to banks of computers, providing the pilots with real-time information on the state of the aircraft. Even though it was still relatively young in 2010, the aircraft was starting to establish itself as a very dependable and safe passenger carrier. However, one vital component of the plane's design would be seriously called into question by the events that were about to transpire on this day. This morning, there was a somewhat odd group of pilots on the flight deck. A captain and a first officer operate the A380 in most cases, but there were 5 pilots in the cockpit on this particular day. In addition to the captain and first officer, there was a second officer assigned to take over in order to allow the other pilots to rest throughout the trip. Additionally, there was a check captain in training who was overseen by another check captain. A check captain's job is to regularly evaluate the flight crew members' performance to make sure they are meeting expectations. The captain was being evaluated today. Richard Crippled, the captain, was seated in the left-hand seat. He was a very accomplished pilot, having flown more than 15,000 hours at the age of 53. He had begun his career as an 11-year member of the Australian Air Force. He launched a computer software firm in the mid-1980s after leaving the Air Force. Then in the late 1980s, he joined Qantas, spending much of his time piloting A330s and 747s. In 2008, he began training to fly the A380. Considering that the aircraft was relatively new, he was still getting used to it at this point. Matt Hicks, a first officer, was second in charge. Hicks was also quite experienced, having flown the A380 for more than twice as many hours as the captain, more than 1,200 hours total. On all, he logged over 11,000 hours of flying time on a range of aircraft, such as the Boeing 747, 767, Airbus A330, and A340. There is no guarantee that increased pilot count will increase safety despite the apparent benefit. The pilot himself had not accrued as much flying hours as the check captain in training or the check captain in charge. It is not unusual for uncertainty to arise under these circumstances over who is really in command, particularly in an emergency. The captain made it plain at the beginning of the flight that the order of command would remain the same, with the captain in charge, the first officer in command, and the other crew members in third, in order to reduce this danger. It would turn out that this form of crew resource management was vital, considering what was about to happen this day. After filling up with 106 tons of gasoline, the enormous aircraft backed out of the gate at Singapore at roughly 5 minutes to 10 in the morning, and the 440 passengers boarded the plane for Sydney. The aircraft's pilot aligned it on runway 20 center at 9:56 a.m. and activated the 4 Rolls-Royce engines to initiate takeoff. After takeoff, everything went according to plan for a brief period of time. As the aircraft ascended over the Singapore Strait, the crew removed the landing gear and the flaps. It reached an acceleration of 250 knots, or around 460 kilometers/a, during this period. but two thunderous blasts jolted the jet as it sailed past 7,000 feet. The second engine, which was the left-hand inboard engine of the aircraft, had blown up. Metal fragments were sent through the engine case at a velocity greater than the sound. Then it blasted straight through the fuselage and left wing. Jet fuel shot out beneath the wing right away, next to the red-hot engine. For everyone on board, it would be disastrous if it caught fire. The autopilot's altitude hold button was immediately activated by the captain, halting the aircraft's ascent. The pilot's only knowledge at this time was that engine number 2 had experienced an issue. The extent of the engine's damage to the remainder of the aircraft was unknown to them at this time. The crew was unaware that the very hot metal fragments that burst from the engine had entered the aircraft's body in one of the worst probable locations. They broke bundles of electrical cable that supplied various aircraft systems, such as the flight controls, electrical power, fire protection, hydraulic power, and more, as they flew through the fuselage at supersonic speeds. A total of 650 wires had been severed. The captain reassured his coworkers that he was in charge of the plane. He gave the first officer instructions to start going through the checklists that were now visible on the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, or ECAM, the central screen that the pilots saw. The crew was calm and concentrated in the cockpit, but they soon realized that this was no typical engine failure. Warning alerts for systems unrelated to the engines have begun to appear on the ECAM. Clearly, something had gone horribly wrong. The passengers seated on the left side of the airplane, in contrast to the pilots, had a front row seat to what had gone wrong. The engine shrapnel had punched holes in the wing, which they could see. Additionally, they saw gasoline pouring back from the airplane and leaking out from under the wing. The damage was starting to show itself back in the cockpit. The crew's initial round of cautions had to do with the engine itself. The ECAM showed many relevant warnings in addition to the ones indicating that the engine had stopped and that the turbine on engine number 2 was overheating. The engine turbine was, in fact, almost completely destroyed. These alerts only alluded to the harm already done. After shooting down the engine, the crew informed air traffic control of their situation. The pilots released one of the engine's 2 fire extinguisher bottles because they thought the engine may have caught fire. Worrisomely, however, they never got word that the bottle had been released. They tried the process again, but this time there was no response. After talking it over, the group agreed it would be prudent to try the second bottle. Once again, there was no indication that anything had occurred when they shot it. They were unaware that the fire suppression system of the engine was one of the systems that had been disrupted by the engine explosion. The last thing they needed was gallons of jet fuel shooting out of a hole in the wing next to the engine. An engine fire. Now was a key moment for them. Meanwhile, huge fragments of engine wreckage had begun to fall from the sky on the island of Batam, which is located just south of Singapore. While others caused damage to homes and automobiles, one piece broke through the roof of a school. Some Batam locals started tweeting that a Qantas plane had crashed after seeing the airline's insignia on some of the debris. Video of the engine debris started airing on news stations as the damaged airplane flew above. As news of a Qantas jet disaster circulated, the company's share price began to plummet. The pilots back in the airplane were unaware of this. They were too preoccupied worrying about the very real possibility that they would not return to Singapore. There were caution signs and alarm bells all throughout the cockpit. He had to choose which cautions to take seriously and which to disregard with the assistance of his coworkers. It was concerning that engine 2 was not the only one a first officer proceeded systematically through the checklist, pressing the push button in front of him to continue canceling these warnings. There has never been a more complicated and serious collection of malfunctions on an Airbus A380, making this emergency situation unique. The airline was automatically receiving the warning alerts that the pilots were receiving at Qantas headquarters in Sydney, but no one there was able to get in touch with the team. The plane's satellite communication system had been disabled by debris from the engine. It was the pilots alone. The first cop was working through the dozens of warning signs that had shown up on the screen in front of him. And even with all his expertise, he was at his limit. That had sustained damage. As a matter of fact, the 3 surviving engines were not running at all. The 2 outboard engines, number 1 and 4, had switched to a degraded state, which prevented the pilots from accessing some engine data. While in what is called an alternative mode, engine number 3 seemed to be in better shape than the other 2 engines. The pilots were uneasy because of this ambiguity. Since we didn't know how the other engines operated, it was possible that the explosion had damaged some of them, and the computers weren't picking this up. The last thing the crew wanted to happen was to have further engine failures and not be able to return to Singapore. They still had a ton of processes to do and hundreds of warning signals to go through. This implied that the pilots would now have to make a difficult choice. Either go back to Singapore right now or take extra time debugging their issues from a distance. Both options carried a substantial risk. The 5 crew members needed to consider their alternatives thoroughly. They ran the danger of the pilots suffering additional harm if they attempted to evaluate the damage while in the air for longer. Aircraft, due to a malfunction in the electrical, hydraulic, or fuel systems. Stated differently, the aircraft could be controlled at this point, but for what length of time? Is it really worth wasting valuable minutes in the air when they could land it right now? However, if they chose to land at this time, there was no way of knowing how the plane would react as it descended and slowed down during the approach. The more than 100 communications that had flashed in the cockpit were still being read by the pilots. They continued to evaluate the damage. Which systems did they have access to, and which did not? Did the flaps operate? The brakes were functional. When they desired it, would the landing gear extend? The pilots would need to provide answers to these important questions prior to their landing. Ultimately, the captain determined that there were more hazards associated with returning right away than with continuing the troubleshooting process. The aircraft was controllable, at least for the time being, and the ship had an ample supply of gasoline. He wanted to wait to go back to Singapore until he understood what he was getting into. The crew requested to be placed in a holding pattern and informed air traffic control that it would take them about 30 minutes to go through the ECAM messages and related procedures. The crew communicated this request to the controller, since the captain was keen to maintain a safe distance from Singapore in case further engines failed. Within a few miles of the airport, the controller in Singapore gave them the go-ahead to hold out over the seas east of Singapore. He then notified the flying crew that locals on the Indonesian island of Batam had discovered many airplane parts. The pilots were shocked to learn this. Since the situation started, it was the first time their brains had been forced to leave the plane. Still, they had no need to worry about this just yet. After the captain put the aircraft into a holding pattern 7,400 feet out over the ocean, the crew set to work troubleshooting the plane. They would give themselves the greatest chance of a safe return to Singapore by compiling an accurate assessment of the aircraft damage. Informing the passengers of this strategy and their desire to return to Singapore after they had determined what was wrong with the aircraft, the captain and the check captain made many statements. Additionally, they gave the passengers comfort by saying that they were prepared to deal with such situations. But in actuality, no one had been educated for this particular situation. The pilots were only starting to deal with the serious and intricate damage that the shrapnel that tore through the aircraft did to vital systems. The crew had to cope with a barrage of signals about the aircraft's hydraulic systems after receiving several alerts regarding the engines. The Airbus A380's landing gear and brakes are hydraulically operated, while the flight controls are powered by a mix of electrical motors and hydraulic actuators. The green system, one of the 2 hydraulic systems on the aircraft, was showing signs of depletion to the pilots. The pilots could tell from this that this was much more catastrophic than a typical engine failure. The pilots would have to rely only on gravity to extend the landing gear as they approached the landing site if the green hydraulic system had malfunctioned, causing the flying controls to become unresponsive. The green hydraulic system drives the slats at the front of the wing in addition to the gear. As the aircraft approaches the landing, the slats are extended to provide more lift and a slower airspeed. The pilots would have to make their landing much quicker than usual if the slats weren't working. The aircraft's ability to stop on the runway was starting to become doubtful due to its inoperable engine and decreasing hydraulic pressure, which was causing a decrease in braking force. The pilots were operating a damaged aircraft that didn't seem to be able to stop once it hit the ground or remain in the air for very long. Worse, the yellow hydraulic system was the only operational hydraulic system, and the sole reliable engine remaining, number 3, was the only one supplying hydraulic power to it. The pilots would be in serious trouble if this again failed. But even in a plane as sophisticated as the A380, the pilots can only learn so much from the equipment. They made the decision to examine the damage themselves in order to have a clearer understanding of what was really going on. In order to examine the damage, the second officer exited the cockpit and entered the passenger compartment. A passenger, who happened to be a Qantas pilot, pointed out the screen in the seat back in front of him as he moved through the top deck of the cabin. Passengers may see a CCTV camera positioned on the tail of the A380 on their displays. He saw an image of the aircraft from the tail camera, with what seemed to be gasoline flowing in large quantities from the left wing on the screen in front of him. It was unclear at this stage whether the fluid was jet fuel or hydraulic fluid. The second officer then descended to the aircraft's lower deck to examine the wing damage up close. He could see the enormous fluid trail as he drew nearer. It originated from the underside of the wing, near the No. 2 engine, and was roughly half a meter in thickness. Furthermore, he said that the turbine area behind the No. 2 engines seemed to have blown off in whole. To share his results with the other pilots, he went back to the cockpit. The pilots chose not to add gasoline to the leaky tank because of the enormous amount of fuel that the second officer saw seeping from the wing. Despite the ECAM's instructions to transfer fuel, the pilots' combined expertise on this trip made it possible for them to do so. Must realize that this is not a secure course of action. They were given several identical warnings, and each time they had to decide whether to accept or reject the ECAM based on their experience. Given the stakes, this was the ultimate test of their abilities and their capacity for high-pressure labor. The 440 passengers behind them had no choice except to wait and pray that the crew was making the correct choices. The pilots would have preferred to dump gasoline at this moment in any other situation. They wanted to be as light as possible for landing because of the weight of their aircraft, the compromised flying controls, and the reduced braking capability. But they couldn't dump gasoline since the explosion had damaged the fuel management system of the airplane. There would be 50 tons overweight for landing as a consequence. Furthermore, the aircraft was starting to become unbalanced. The left wing was losing a lot of fuel, so much so that it was now almost 10 tons lighter than the right wing, and the difference was becoming bigger by the minute. This imbalance would worsen the longer the crew troubleshot from the air. The team had finally reached the end of their list, having spent more than an hour sorting through the hundreds of ECAM communications. They had developed a common mental image of the damage to their aircraft during this period. Landing their damaged jet was now the only task remaining. However, there was an issue. They were 50 tons too heavy. This would be an issue even if everything else about the aircraft was how it should be. However, the aircraft was not in a typical condition. The explosion had badly compromised its braking capacity. To determine if they could halt on the runway, the pilots required a method. They accomplished this by calculating their landing distance using the landing performance application, a part of the aircraft's onboard information system. They provided the computer with data, including the weight of the aircraft the state of the Singaporean runway, and the identification of the flying controls and aircraft systems that were not working. The concept was to enable the computer to determine the aircraft's stopping distance precisely by providing precise information about its state. However, there was yet another issue. The computer was unable to determine the landing distance when the pilots input these factors. It was just not built to handle the volume of faults the aircraft was having. The pilots were forced to improvise since they needed to estimate the landing distance. One by one, beginning with the least significant failures, they experimented with the computer. In this case, staff resource management, or collaboration, was crucial. Based on their own experiences, each pilot contributed, and the crew as a whole attempted to identify a set of factors that they felt adequately represented the condition of the aircraft. They repeatedly performed the landing computation, removing a new issue each time, until at last the computer provided a response. The computer indicated that since they were overweight and the leading edge slats were broken, they would have to approach 35 knots quicker than usual. Their landing distance would be further increased as a result. They may, however, pull over on the runway. Error margin was really narrow. In reality, the computer predicted that they would halt with just 130 meters remaining on the 4,000-meter runway. A runway overrun would occur if the captain did anything other than very accurate flying, which would not be good for the passengers. Furthermore, there remained a danger that they might go off the end of the runway even if the crew performed flawlessly. Their landing distance was just estimated by the computer, because it was an estimate based on an imprecise depiction of the aircraft's damage. The captain summoned the lead flight attendant and instructed them to get the cabin ready for a runway overrun and subsequent evacuation, because there was a very serious chance that the aircraft would go off the end of the runway. The pilots also reported to air traffic control that gasoline was leaking from the left wing, and that they would need emergency assistance upon landing. The pilots wanted to make sure the aircraft was controlled before heading back towards the airport. It would be preferable to learn about any significant problems influencing the aircraft's flight characteristics now rather than discovering them during final approach. The pilot checked the plane's controllability in each configuration, lowering the flaps incrementally until they reached flap number 3, which they would use for landing. He discovered that the aircraft was quite slow yet manageable. The airplane was substantially slower to bank left and right when part of its wing spoilers were lost. For the crew to execute a steady approach, they would have to align with the runway far out. After requesting this from air traffic control, they were routed for a 20-mile final to Singapore's runway 20 center. The pilots then lowered the gear by using the gravity extension handle. The gear seems to have extended properly after a tense moment. After that, the pilot gave the aircraft another controllability check to make sure it could still be flown with its gear and flaps extended. The aircraft was again slow, but yet maneuverable. But with engine number 2 shut down and engines 1 and 4 operating at a reduced capacity, it was far from guaranteed that the jet would land at all. Every approach calls for frequent adjustments to engine thrust, but the captain was hesitant to engage engines 1 and 4's thrust levers since he wasn't sure how well they would perform. Since engine 3 was the only one that seemed intact, he made the compromise of maintaining the same thrust settings for engines 1 and 4 while using it to regulate the plane's speed. They were now aligned with the runway and prepared for landing. This was a nerve-wracking approach over the water for the passengers. It would be the crucial time for the pilots. Did they calculate the landing distance correctly? Could the aircraft be maneuvered while on the ground? Could they possibly pause in time? The pilot's ability to land the damaged aircraft at the proper position and stop it before the runway terminated was crucial to the safety of the over 500 persons on board. The plane landed quickly. The skipper floored it and engaged reverse thrust on engine number 3, the sole operational engine. The first officer pushed the captain to use full manual brakes as the jet tore down the runway. When the first officer verified that the captain was truly using maximum brakes, Using his own pedals that were connected to the captain's, he discovered that the captain had in fact pulled them to their stops. The runway's end was drawing near quickly. The enormous aircraft started to slow down gradually. The crew was sure that it would stop in time when it reached roughly 60 knots. However, there was a fresh issue when it eventually came to rest, just 150 meters from the end of the runway actually, now more than at any other time throughout the trip. The crew and passengers were in danger. Fuel was still leaking from the left wing and beginning to collect underneath the aircraft, and it began to approach the wheels as it fanned out on the ground. The brake's temperature had risen to 900 degrees Celsius, as the pilots could see on their screens. A fire may start if the gasoline got in touch with the white-hot brakes. In addition, the crew had received a radio alert from the fire department informing them that the main outboard engine, located on the left side, was still operational. Nothing managed to stop it, despite the crew's best efforts, including pulling the lever to cut off the engine's gasoline supply. 3 tons of jet fuel were strewn over the runway, while the engine remained locked on maximum power. The captain had to make a crucial choice. Should he keep the passengers on board despite the possibility of a catastrophic fuel explosion, or should he tell them to leave right away? After considering all of their alternatives, the flight crew concluded that the passengers were safest inside the aircraft at that particular time. Thousands of kilos of gasoline and a jet engine in operation were located outside the airplane. That being said, the cabin would have to be evacuated right away if a fire broke out. On the PSA, the captain announced something in code. System, alerting the cabin staff to the impending evacuation. The firefighters started sprinkling fire retardant over the fuel underneath the airplane. The flight crew ultimately concluded that the safest course of action would be to have the passengers depart by an air staircase on the right side of the aircraft, 13 minutes after the plane had touched down. They had to use their cell phones to call the firm to send their air stairs to the aircraft, however, as the explosion had damaged all but one of their radios, which they were using to communicate with the fire department. After almost 20 more minutes, these steps and a few buses to transport the 440 people to the terminal showed up. The passengers were returned to the airport terminal once they had gradually disembarked. 3 hours after landing, firefighters were able to eventually shut down the first engine by dousing it in foam that retards fire. Amazingly, not a single passenger or crew member sustained injuries throughout the whole experience. One of the greatest displays of airmanship in aviation history, according to retired Royal Air Force helicopter pilot and human factors specialist Carrie Edwards, was made possible by the flight crew's amazing cooperation and decision-making. The Order of Australia was given to the captain, Richard Crippled, in recognition of his extraordinary flying and professionalism during a crisis. However, what initially triggered this disastrous engine failure? How did a brand new airplane with an impeccable track record be so close to catastrophe? Investigators discovered that a tiny fracture had grown over time in one of the engine's pipes. Oil began to seep through it and onto the engine turbine as it became bigger. When this oil came into contact with the hot turbine inside on Belt 32, it ignited. One of the turbine discs was damaged by heat from the ensuing fire, and because it was spinning normally, the damage prevented the disc from withstanding the rotational forces and it burst. An uncontained engine failure occurs when turbine disc pieces burst so quickly that they flew out of the engine case. Because the engine casing is especially designed to prevent this from occurring, this is an uncommon occurrence. It was very lucky that none of the engine debris entered the passenger compartment, since this may have resulted in fatalities. The engine's manufacturer, Rolls-Royce, had a manufacturing issue that was the primary cause of this oil pipe malfunction. Consequently, all A380s equipped with the Trent 900 engine type had checks done on them. 53 of these engines were taken out of service after these examinations. There hasn't been a similar occurrence on the Airbus A380 after this safety enhancement. The airplane that was damaged in this event was repaired for $145 million, and it is now being flown by Qantas. Lastly, here's an intriguing bit of trivia. A few days after the event, the captain of this aircraft boarded a voyage home to Sydney, but that plane's engine failed soon after takeoff as well, forcing the flight to return to Singapore. After spending many more days trapped in Singapore, he eventually returned to Australia. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never missed out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.